Good afternoon, everyone. This is Betsy Hill, President and Chief Operating Officer of Learning Enhancement. And I am hearing feedback, so I'm not sure why that is.
Well, that's because you have me.
Okay, all right. Anyway, we want to welcome you to our Neuroscience and Education webinar for this afternoon, and we're delighted that you're all here. We are recording the webinar today, and the recording should be available in about a week on our website, so if you have colleagues who you think might be interested or you want to look at it again, you will have the opportunity to do that. Everyone's phone is muted at the moment except for me and our presenter. So if you have questions during the webinar, please use the chat window or the Q&A window on the right-hand side of your screen, either one, and type your questions in there, and we will hope to have some time to get to them at the end. I think that is it for housekeeping at the moment, so we can go ahead and get started. And I need to share my desktop, and I need to pull up my present PowerPoint here, so we'll have something to look at. And now you got my search engine here instead of, we're getting there. All right, so in just a moment you will see this. And while I'm doing that, what I'd like to do is introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Patricia McGuire. And Pat is a behavioral pediatrician with lots of amazing credentials. She has 30 years of experience as a developmental and behavioral pediatrician. She's the mother of 3 very special children, and I expect we might hear about 1 or 2 of them today. She also wrote a wonderful book called Never Assume, Getting to Know Children Before Labeling Them. She speaks all around the country on Autism Spectrum Disorders, ADD and ADHD, Dyslexia, learning disabilities, and other issues in child development. In her book, she talks about 9 traits that often make children look like something other than what they are. At least that's sort of how the impression I had from talking to her so far and getting into this a little bit. Hence, we have all these labels and all these mislabels. So what I'd like to do, Pat, is first of all welcome you. We're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And so one of the topics that we said you were going to talk about is temperament, but maybe you could help us out and just sort of tell us what temperament is.
That's a good question because a lot of people don't understand that, Betsy. Temperament are traits of behavior that we're all born with. We inherit these traits from our families. And then these traits, along with other life experiences, other like neurodevelopmental disorders, other mental health issues, help mold or develop our personality. So there's a how of our interaction in the world around us. Now, if you want to show the first slide.
Sure, we'll do. This is from some research, some charts of your own students.
It was a chart review done for the years 2010 and 2011. I had my staff pull all the charts of people that came in my office with the diagnosis of somewhere in the autism spectrum. And to give you some framework of how this looks, technically when you do the graph, it's more of a sideways rather than an up and down bar graph, so it's a side graph instead. But the -1 means -1 standard deviation below the average or the mean. The 0 is the average or the mean. And the +1 is 1+. So when you look at activity level, a -1 means very low activity, and that's what we kind of like in life is kids that aren't bouncing all over the place. A -1 for rhythmicity is very rhythmic, organized, all of that. And the +1, like when you talk about sensory threshold, that means super sensitive, notices everything. Like you mentioned, your mother called you the princess and the pea.
I did tell you that, and you remembered.
I remember a lot of things. So if we go through this population, there were 56 patients that ended up with an autism spectrum diagnosis, disorder diagnosis. 14 were female, 42, which is the usual breakdown, about 4-to-1 male to female. And what you found is a lot of these kids were in the +1 in certain areas. Like a number of them were +1 on activity, which means they required more activity to feel comfortable and being able to interact. So if you talk about kids in general, a -1, a very low activity kid, is the one that sits very well in class, but they drive you crazy because it's like they have two speeds, no speed and slow speed. So you're forever saying, hurry up, come on, let's get going. And when they try, they still can't. And that's a beautiful example of that. The kids are on the go, very active, versus Homer Simpson, who just sits there like a couch potato. And
so these are traits not just of kids with autism spectrum disorders, but all of us have these traits, right?
That's right. All of us have these issues with, you know, some of us may be very low activity, and I tend to be more of a low activity person, unfortunately, which creates some weight problems for me. Whereas I have a husband and 3 kids who all are very high activity level. They get antsy very quickly. They get stressed very quickly if they have to be, you know, in contained spaces. And I joked, but it's the truth, is that my husband gave all my kids all these wonderful diagnoses before I realized who I'd married, and so they all have ADHD, dyslexia, and dysgraphia. I'm the only one in the house with an attention surplus disorder.
I've never heard that term, but I think it's a wonderful term.
Oh yeah, I'm the one that keeps track of all the rest of them. So.
Oh, I can see. I misspelled rhythmicity. I apologize for that. There should be
yeah, that
TH
happens. There's too many H's and all that in there. But rhythmicity is how well our inside clock kind of matches up with the outside world. So the ability to have consistency with wake cycle, sleep cycle, hunger cycle, organization, management of time, and that's a beautiful, you know, rhythm of life, circadian rhythm going there. And there are kids that are extremely rigid in the spectrum, as you see with the reddish colors, but the majority have a very poor sense of their internal clock. They're clueless as to time going on around them. And in that category, there's 2 main groups and a third that's a mixture. The first I call my deer in the headlight group. They truly have no sense that time is moving around them until someone brings it to their attention. Kind of like, come on, the school bus is here. It's like, oh, I thought I had 20 more minutes. And then, of course, if they don't like something, 5 minutes feels like an hour. Then we also have problems with them in that they can't organize because they can't visualize what's needed and how long it takes to get it together. So, you know, we talk about kids that look lazy, unmotivated, kids whose bedrooms are black holes. Those are kids that really can't figure out how to put everything together. So they have no sense of rhythm, sequence, temporal, spatial movement. They're just lost in time. But there's also a second group that still don't have a good sense, but they're bugged by it. And I call them the time checkers, because they do buy into every strategy we try to teach them, the lists, the calendars, the timers, anything, and they're also always asking when, how long till, which can drive us crazy.
So you talked about the second group being more amenable and receptive to strategies.
Yes.
But what about the first group? Are they just hopelessly, perennially lost, or are there some things that work for them?
That's a good question, because you can train them, but it's harder because they don't feel the stress until they're running into the wall. Like, I've worked with a lot of ADHD kids, and what you hear from them, because they have the same problem, is that they don't realize the project is due until the night before, because finally the calendar says tomorrow is. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot more on our part to help them realize that the time is, and we have to do a lot more hands-on, a lot more supervising to be able to...
interim deadlines and things like that.
Oh, yes, definitely, interim deadlines, because they don't feel anything until it's there. And then, of course, you have a third group that has a bit of both. So they'll buy in a little bit, but at the same time, they're still surprised that time has caught up with them again. Now, approachability is how long it takes to get comfortable with different people, places, situations. And in my population, yeah, those kids. I had a small group that were very, very approachable, kind of like that little boy in the bottom, where they don't recognize that some people you have to give them, an arm's length. They're the ones that are in your face. They don't, they don't understand the pleasantries. It's just like, oh, you're my friend, let's go do this now. But then, like the one with the shrinkling nose, the majority are very slow to get comfortable with people, places, situations. They would like you to be at not just an arm length, but a football field length away. And even then, they're uncomfortable with you. So those are the ones in classrooms who don't raise their hand to ask questions or to contribute to classes. If they don't understand something, they may just shut down. They're not asking for help. And that's because they get so anxious inside. It's like, what happens if?
So that's why we're seeing that bluish grayish
Yes.
bar so high,
Mm-hmm.
because they're all on that distance, that side of they don't want to be approached, and they feel uncomfortable when they're, I don't know, is it their space is being invaded, or it's just...
Right, yeah. For them, it takes them so long to get comfortable. So if you change anything, they're uncomfortable again. And this is where, when you talk especially about autism, you have kids that if you change something in their classroom or their room, or you change your appearance, like all of a sudden you change your hair color, or you put your hair up, if it's usually down, or down when it's usually up, it really throws them, because now you're not you. Now the room's not it. I had one boy who was in a self-contained classroom, and over the summer they decided to do some freshening up the room, so they painted his classroom. And that first day of school, he walked to the door, and he had a meltdown because he was not entering his classroom. This was someone else's classroom. And it's all because the color had changed.
So is that adaptability trait?
That also hits the adaptability, but the approachability is the recognizing that someone or someplace is safe to be around, that I can relax, let my hair down, all of that. But if you change who someone is, it's like, okay, I don't recognize you. You're different.
Okay, so that's
so
just
now
a different person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got to get comfortable with you all over again. But adaptability, as you can see from the graph, none of my kids were easily adaptable. The grand majority of them were what I call the why kids. Why me? Why now? Why this way? And they don't budge until you answer the whys. And it's not, as all parents do and a lot of teachers do, it's not because I said so or because I'm the parent. Because that's not a why answer. That's a who answer.
Right.
And have you ever said that to your kids? And they said, why do I have to do it? And you said, because I said so?
Well, I tried very hard not to. They did wear me down occasionally. I confess.
Oh, yeah.
I did get there a few times.
Well, so did I. But, I learned because I didn't like it as a kid because I was a why kid. And the thing is, I didn't understand the process, the thought that went into it. And so I was very anxious. And there have been studies now that have looked at not just kids with autism, but kids that are labeled oppositional defiant disorder. And 2/3 of them have a foundation of anxiety as to why they are oppositional, because they can't predict, they can't read your mind, they can't anticipate. And so until everything is spelled out, they don't want to budge, because if they budge, something could happen.
So they're sort of, it's threatening to them when anything changes,
yes,
because they don't know, and there may be some adverse consequence if they don't react properly. So they're really girding themselves against any change.
Yes, that's why, especially kids in the autism spectrum, you see so many rituals and, inflexible routines, because at least then they know if I go from A to B, what B will be. Mm-hmm. If you change your route from home to the grocery store or to school, they have meltdowns because they can't predict if you can get there.
Okay, so the next, now I've gotten my...
Yeah, one more.
It's my computer screen has decided to be
yeah.
difficult. There we go.
Okay. Then intensity of response, how much they show of whatever they're feeling from one moment to the very next, be it happy, sad, glad, or bored. And that's like the second-to-second change. Can you tell if someone's emotions are changing? And I had a large group that from second to second you couldn't tell. It didn't mean they weren't feeling things. It just meant it may take a long time for it to surface, which is where I would hear a lot of people say that these kids were unpredictable. They'd blow out of nowhere. But it was just slowly building up from things that occurred earlier. And then I had one group, it was always hard to tell. Oh, no, I had one group that you could always tell. That was the blue group, because whatever happened, they immediately had a response. But they were what I called light switch responses. Because if something seemed funny, they were like rolling on the floor laughing. They couldn't just grin or ha-ha. They just always had to have that same intent. If they were hurt, you couldn't tell if they had a paper cut or they cut off a limb, because they had that same intensity of emotion. And those are the ones we always think about because, you know, they're always so abrupt in your face, and we actually have to figure out how to teach them those variations, what I call dimmer switches of emotions. Because in the middle group, we had some that, you know, we had a large number that would go back and forth. Yes, intensity counts. That's a good one. So, but, you know, it's hard to deal with the kids that are always intense because the situation doesn't always allow that same level of intensity, and so we get upset with them. But they don't know how to adjust it.
Right, they don't have that scale, that
right.
sort of, yeah.
So especially with kids in the autism thing, but anybody who has this problem, we have to spend time teaching them how to notice, how to adjust, almost like we're helping them create an internal electrician to go from a light switch to a dimmer switch. And
so do you come up with terminology for that? Do you use that analogy of a dimmer switch?
I use that analogy, and I use a lot of pictures. I do a lot of stuff with them, and there's other people doing this around the country, the idea of role-playing. There's a lot of what's called drama therapy getting started around the country. I talked with some people out in Florida just this last week that focus on drama therapy to teach them how to express at different levels based on what the character would do. Mm-hmm. And so then over time, it gets generalized a little better, and how would so-and-so do this, so do you think you should do that? So a lot of stuff teaching them how to be characters in a play can also teach them how to modify their intensity based on certain situations.
Oh, that makes sense.
Now, the next group are the mood group. It's like the first impression of everything. You know, do you start out with the glass half empty or half full? And I had one crowd that they're always half full. They were what we call the Pollyannas. They could never anticipate that something could go wrong. But that was a very small group. But they were the ones you always said they set themselves up for failure because they didn't think through, you know, the downsides, the things, you know, all the steps to go through. They were just always the cheerleaders. But then you had the ones on the flip side that I always said they could find the cloud for any silver lining, because the first words out of their mouth for anything is, I can't, this sucks, it won't work, I won't like it, no one will play with me. Yeah, and you go, come on, you've always liked it before, you've always, you know, found when you got there that it wasn't as bad as you thought. But arguing that with them doesn't work. It just makes them more upset, because in their mind, how do you have the right to say that your first impression is right and mine is wrong? And you'll even get sometimes the kids, I won't like it no matter how much fun it is, just because they get, you know, mad at you for telling them that they don't have a right to have an opinion. Mm. And we deal a lot with those kind of kids. When you look at the three temperament traits of slow adaptability, intensity of response, and basic mood, when they're all in the blue area, but it doesn't have to, it can also be the yellow for intensity, those are the kids that when you go look up, you know, mental health diagnoses, they frequently have the diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. But it's a problem with temperament, where we literally have to spend time teaching them how to see, you know, it's basically it's a cognitive skill, how to plan, how to organize, how to reflect, how to think of the options. And
right, so that on mood, is it sort of thinking, okay, well, it could be really bad, but are there any other things, other ways it could turn out?
Right. Like with my oldest, who, and she knows this, it's the first chapter in that book you mentioned, my Never Assume book. I said she was born with PMS. So basically, she had PMS before she was a teenager. She was born that way. And she really could find the cloud and a silver lining. So she was slow to adapt to change. She was withdrawal. She was intense. She was negative mood. And if she was invited to a birthday party, she'd want to go, but she'd be saying, oh, the what ifs. But what if nobody likes me? What if they don't like my gift? I don't think they're going to like my gift. I'm not going to like what they serve for food. I'm not going to like everybody there. And, of course, if I argue and say you'll have fun, it's all the kids from your class, that wouldn't get us anywhere. So I had to learn with her to not say those things, but to rather help her with the reasoning and the problem solving and the planning skills that were weak with her. So I'd say, oh, geez, I hope that doesn't happen. What should we do if it does? So then we kind of worked through some options like, well, maybe I'd stay around longer at first. So as she sized it up, if she thought it was going to be awful, we could come up with an excuse why she couldn't stay. Or if she had me come back later, in case she wasn't having fun. And usually I'd come back later and I'd say, how's it going? If she said, no, it sucks, then I'd say, okay, well, that's why we made the plan, because you had concerns. But if she was having a good time, I learned again the hard way, not to say I knew you would have a good time, because then she'd find some reason why it wasn't perfect. But instead to say, well, I'm still glad, we had a plan in place because you had concerns that you might not like it. So this way, if you needed to go home early, you could. But now we can stay around until everybody else goes home. It's literally teaching her that. And as she got older, she got better at internalizing that, so that when something came up, she'd first think through those. She'd go through planning, the problem solving, and then she'd come to me with, I'm concerned I may not like this, or it won't be fun. Could we do this in case that happens?
Oh, so she was coming up with her own solution.
Right. But I had to spend time teaching her those strategies.
Sure.
Those are cognitive skills that the blue levels don't have.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit to me like the research that's been done recently on test anxiety and high stakes situation anxiety, choking when it's performance time, where they've found that getting someone just to write about their anxiety and write about the beforehand actually improves performance significantly. So it's almost, I'm just getting a hint of that here, where it's not negating it, but it's allowing a chance to express it, and then thinking through the process of, well, maybe I won't do well, but I know the stuff, so maybe I will, and just having some alternatives to think through.
Oh, definitely. And that's where, when I have new kids coming in, quite often I hear from the parents, I have from the paperwork and the questionnaires of the teachers, that these kids, they're stubborn, they're manipulative, they refuse to do things, and sometimes you get the word lazy or unmotivated in there. But I find a lot of it comes from the temperament profile that shuts them down, and then later when we look at the processing tests I did, where a lot of processing issues can come in as problems too.
Sure. And then it's about teaching them the skills. It's not just punishing them because they don't. These are things that they have to learn that they didn't necessarily come into the world with.
That's right. Yeah, and their parents didn't either. So you expect the parents to help the kids. Well, if they didn't learn the strategies, if no one understood how to teach them the strategies, then it just makes it worse coming home.
Right.
So we go on to the next one, persistence, ability to stay with any one thing till completed. And what you saw is I did not have any super persistent kids in the autism spectrum for those 2 years. And that's not surprising. These kids have a terrible time persisting. And there's two main reasons for that, and a third, again, it's a mixture. The first group are the ones that truly do get bored easily. And my definition is that child themselves, we'll call it Charlie. Charlie will say, I can do that. Oh, but it's repetitive. It's monotonous. Can we do it together? Can we make a race out of it? Or the famous, what do I get when I'm done? There's a lot of studies now looking at the anatomy of brains, especially with ADHD, and they found that the area of the brain dealing with motivation and gratification is not as well developed. So they truly do require external motivators, because that internal motivation, which we all want everybody to have, to do it because we know it's the responsible thing to do or whatever, is not developing in their brain the way it does in typical children. And so they require that external to get them there. Now, the second group, they may get started, but as soon as they hit the I have no clue what to do, they either hide it behind them, like if you don't see it, doesn't exist, like, do you have homework tonight? No, I don't. Or they get angry, they get frustrated, they shut down, this is dumb, this is stupid, this is boring, I can't do it. And with those kids, if you try to offer a motivator, they just get mad because they're looking at you like you're an idiot because they already told you they can't do it, and now you're punishing them. Because you say, well, if you get done by whatever time, then you can go play with your friends, and they get mad because they say that's unfair because they already told you I'm clueless.
So they're being offered. It's like having something taken away instead of having something be offered.
Right. Mm-hmm. So frequently these kids will in some way let us know if it's a need for motivation. They'll either say, well, can you stay with me, or will I have not, if I get done in 10 minutes, can I go out and play? Different things that sound like negotiation. Those are things telling you that they recognize they need something to go forward to. But if they don't, you have to first make the assumption that it's not a motivation problem. You say, oh, well, would you like some help? Would you like me to start you on the first one? So you have to size them up. And if they start saying something about motivation, then you can go there. But otherwise, it's how do you help them with the idea of breaking it down into understandable chunks. The whole idea of, problem solving, planning, logic, reasoning, all of that is a big thing that can stop them. Mm-hmm. And so you have to kind of ask them that.
Now, this is an example of something that I have been sort of curious about with all of these traits, is that as you've talked about these being genetically driven, if maybe not determined, because obviously there's the interaction with the environment. But some of these things sound like they can be trained more than others. So, example, so I'm sort of wondering whether on persistence, if those who aren't looking for an external motivator, but are doing the, I can't do that, this is boring, this is stupid, if through experience and having success, can that change some? Can that get better?
Definitely it can improve things. That's the key when you have kids that are really stressing, is that we have to figure out how to teach them the strategies. And that's why some people as adults don't look as bad as they did as kids. Even though if you do a temperament profile on them, they're still the same person. But the more strategies, the more skills we can teach them, the more they can handle their day-to-day world. And you may not see that full expression of that trait come back out until they've hit a stress mode where they don't have a strategy that's working, and then they don't know how to make another strategy. Mm-hmm. So the more we can help them develop strategies and learn how to apply to different situations, the better. And, of course, the group in the autism spectrum have the hardest time because they have a difficult time generalizing. They're very concrete, plan A for situation A, plan B for situation B. So we have to work even harder with them to be able to allow them to understand how to use a strategy in several types of situations, or how to modify a strategy for several situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one.
It's a lot of work, unfortunately. But when you think that, they're relying on us to teach them, that's the important part.
Now, the next one is something that I'm sure, tongue-in-cheek, none of the people on here have any children who are at all distractible.
Oh, no. No, not even my husband and 3 kids are distractible. Right, I spend all my time thinking about the movie Up. And, of course, the dog's going, squirrel.
Right.
So, but, yeah, in this population, I had a large number, actually, that were very hyper-focused. And I would see, teacher Vanderbilts that would say this kid's distractible, at the same time would say they don't shift their attention. But it's a matter of how well you can divide your attention as needed for a situation. And with this population, it was very hard for them to divide. They'd be focused on what they were focused on, and it was hard for them to double focus or triple focus. Things that all mothers have to do. We multi-focus because we have to attend to many things at once, especially if you have preschoolers. And right now I'm dealing with grandkids that are preschoolers, and you feel like you need to be an octopus with 8 arms to keep them all out of trouble. That also means you have to attend to them. And so these kids have a very hard time. Now, some people think that that's being distractible, but it's actually a problem with dividing your attention or shifting your focus as needed. And so some of these kids, they're focused on what they're doing, and they can't shift when the teacher says, now put your books away and we're going to go, to the gym, or we're going to do circle time, or we're going to do something else. And the teacher has to keep coming over, come on, put your stuff away. I said, put it away. And they get kind of teed off because they're still stuck at what they're doing.
That sounds like also a little bit like that rhythmicity that you were talking about.
In a way,
before.
yes.
Is that a little bit similar?
Similar, but not quite. In that, with this, it's just I'm so focused I can't shift easily. It's like the difference between a semi-truck shifting their gears and a Porsche being able to shift to the next thing. But then I also had a small group that were super distractible. They had trouble keeping their focus on anything. They were definitely the dog from Up. Now, the last one, sensory threshold, is how much it takes to notice those little things always changing around us, like taste, touch, texture, temperature. Oh, there's the Princess and the Pea. And I had a group that were very hypo-responsive. And when we think of kids with autism spectrum, we think about the fact that, they say we had them checked for hearing loss because they wouldn't attend when we were talking to them. They were the ones that had a high pain threshold, so they would be injured and nobody would know it. And, they definitely, it took more to engage them in their environment because they weren't picking up the subtle signals. But then there was also a very small group that were super sensitive to everything, kind of like the Princess and the Pea. And it'd be like every seam, every tag, every smell, every sound. They were the very food picky kind of kids because things didn't taste right, so they had a very narrow palate. And if you changed it all, even if you just changed the brand, all of a sudden they wouldn't do it because the brand tasted different. Oftentimes I considered it at a molecular level. The rest of us couldn't tell a difference, but they could. And so that's when we, get a lot of frustration is with the kids that are in that area. Now, there was a study not quite a year ago that was published. It was a clinic-based study looking at autism and temperament. They used the same profile type questionnaire that I did, and they had, like maybe 4 times as many kids, but they had the same outcome with those blue areas. And so they were saying that, when you think about kids in the autism spectrum, you're going to have a lot more problems with approachability and adaptability and mood and persistence. And so it's kind of, when you have now my chart review and their, report is saying, okay, definitely this is very typical. I'm thinking that, people listening today would also say, well, yeah, I can think of kids like that. I can also think of kids that don't have autism that have this. And you're right, about 1 child in 7 will have a profile kind of like this where they're just very intense in everything. And those are the ones that make it into my office about 99% of the time because they require PhD level parenting because all you want to do is kill them some days.
Yeah, I know parents who have just claimed that they were deserve the Nobel Prize just for having their kids make it to adulthood.
Oh, definitely, yes.
So
I'm on the list.
So this is yeah, it sounds like it from what you've been talking about. So, but some of these, well, this is a profile where you've got the plus or minus a standard deviation of difference from normal, sort of across the board. But do you see also children who just would be off in one particular area?
If you look in general, if you look at any one child, you're going to find some that are be more midline, but in general, you're finding, like I said, I had 56 kids, and so it showed that when you do a large group, you're going to see a tendency toward a certain area. Like the adaptability and the persistence, we didn't have any in 56 kids that were super adaptable and super persistent. We had very few that were positive in their mood. And so you're finding that it's heavier into either a mix of sometimes they can adapt, sometimes they can't, or they just can't adapt without a lot of help. Now, when you look at ADHD, you see a lot of the same things. In fact, if you think about temperament traits with ADHD, you'd be looking at the kids that are more in the blue area for activity, persistence, and distractibility.
Mm-hmm. So that would be that particular cluster of traits.
Yeah, and when you talk about anxiety disorders and depression, along with oppositional defiant, it'd be like approachability, adaptability, mood, and plus or minus the intensity, because some are very, externalizing and others are internalizing. And also you have some kids that are extremely persistent, kind of we call them perfectionistic.
Mm.
And so that might be where they're super persistent when you talk about other populations.
Right. Now we have a couple questions. Might just take a moment to touch on those before we move on to the learning issues and the more the cognitive kinds of problems. One is whether there are any parallels between the temperament profile of autism to the symptoms of bipolar disease.
That's a good question, and I don't know if anyone's done a temperament profile, clustering to look at that. Definitely individually you could see some that would be like that, but you might see, looking at intensity of response, that they're extremely intense always with their responses. It's like they don't have a good light switch. And you might see a higher positivity of mood because they tend to get that euphoria of I can do everything, I can
or I can do
off.
nothing. I mean, that's the other. Yeah. So you're going to get that intensity of mood, whether it's one side or the other.
Like I said, I haven't seen anyone who's done a study looking at temperament with that population, but I could see for those couple of traits where that would come and happen. And a lot of them also will have a higher activity level, which is why a number of them are comorbid with ADHD and why we see the ADHD before we see the bipolar. Because usually it's that high activity level that we notice with these kids more than problems just with focus, attention, memory, organization.
Right. And then the other question was about generalizing the strategies and how you would generally approach. I think I'm saying the word general a little bit too much. Helping.
You can say sergeant, I don't know.
Helping kids take strategies and move them to different situations, I guess.
Yeah, because the kids in the autism spectrum, I think, are the extreme of how do we do this because they're so concrete and literal. And when you look at adaptability, the ones that are slow to adapt are very concrete and literal. But it is saying that we have to slow down and realize that for all strategies, we have to keep helping them until they get their aha, not when we think they should have their aha. Like the slow to adapt to change, if they're very concrete and literal, initially we can teach them a strategy for dealing with problem A, but they may not see the similarities in the next problem to apply it for. And so we literally have to, kind of doing strategizing before they hit something or afterwards and saying, well, how would you see where this would be kind of like this? Do you think this could apply? And I've done that with kids with a whiteboard where they have problems on the playground or they have problems with their siblings. And I go through, these are the options. You know, option A, you know, is you could punch the kid out. But of course, you'll get in trouble either with the recess monitor and the principal or with your parents. Number 2, you could, you know, go tell somebody so they help you with it. And number 3, you could just go do something else. And I've had kids in the autism, that deals with that adaptability, how to handle situations. And I've had kids with autism spectrum that if I use that board and I keep erasing the kid's name and put someone else's name up there, all of a sudden they hit the, well, what would happen if instead of my brother, this was the kid down the block and his name is, you know, Sean. I'll say, okay, we'll put Sean up. Let's see if this works for Sean. And then they start saying, well, what about this person? So initially I model putting someone else's name in there and walk through how to handle the situation. And eventually they start hitting the, oh, so could we try it with that? Could we do it with that? And so it's helping. It's kind of like when all kids are small, you know, you're in the grocery store at the checkout line and they always beg for food, right? You never had that?
Oh, no, I did. In fact, there was, yes, they do beg for food. And then I had the time when my middle son was following along, and when I was checking out, it just seemed like it was a little more expensive than I expected it to be. And I got home, and he had put one of everything that I had put into the cart, just about. So he was
I love it. Oh, yeah.
Anyway, we were stocked up for a while after that one.
I can imagine. But, yeah, with this, you know, you finally teach them not to ask for food at the checkout line at the grocery store, but then you go to Walmart or Target, and this is before they had grocery stores with my kids, and then the checkout lines, they're begging for stuff again. I said, what did I tell you about checkout lines? Well, you don't ask for things at the checkout line at the grocery store. This is Target, or this is Walmart, or this is Kmart.
Somehow different.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So then I had to keep expanding until, no, it doesn't matter what checkout line, you don't ask for things. And then one time we walked to a convenience store, and they didn't have a checkout line, they had a checkout counter. And they started begging again. I said, what did I say? They told me that this was not a checkout line, it was a checkout counter, so then I had to expand the definition again. Which a lot of parents will say that, well, they're looking for the loopholes, they know better because they can, think this through. It's like, well, no, they're seeing it very concretely, this is something different. We understand that, but they don't understand that.
So it just seems like it takes a bunch of repetition and a bunch of exposure and some really having them walk through that. Okay, so,
right.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so basically, when you talk about how to help these kids, it's using those type of strategies, but remembering the 5 S's. And these are important S's, especially the first one. The first one is stay calm. Because if you don't stay calm, they're not going to learn anything. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to say that because the core of me is a screaming Irish mother. I was taught that you do it because I said so. And if you're going to cry, I'll give you a reason to cry. And if you hurt yourself, don't come to me looking for pity because you know you shouldn't have done it. That didn't work with my kids. So I had to become someone else, which is a different story. But staying calm really helps. Also, speaking less, really choosing your words, because that can make or break it. And I always tell people, practice communicating on Twitter, because you're only allowed 140 characters. So if you want your message to be heard, you have to be able to speak less. Bring in visuals or other things that can help them understand. And then also slow down, especially as, you now have the slide up for the RAML scores, and we're talking about processing. Kids with neurodevelopmental disorders, of which autism is one of them, they need a longer processing time. And then simplify, which is what I was doing with the idea of breaking down the strategies and the problem solving, breaking it down to its elements. And also stop and wait, so they have time to digest it in their brain, so to speak.
That all sound like really, really good advice.
And as I can relate, it's sometimes easier said than done. Oftentimes easier said than done. So.
Well, if it takes them something to learn strategies, then it takes, we all have to learn the strategies, and it takes practice, and it takes time, and we may not be perfect at it, but it sounds like these are things that really can help you get through those really touchy situations. So let's switch a little over to, if we can, to the issues of learning and memory, and these are the RAMA, which is the Wide Range Assessment of Memory and Learning, and these again are charts, patient charts.
It was a chart review,
and
so it didn't take 2 total years. It was all of 2011 and part of 2012. And I just had my staff pull the charts of all the new patients that came in during that time, and that was 154 patients. Of those 154, 105 did have the RAML administered. Now, the ones that didn't, either they just came in for some behavioral concerns, or they were less than 5 years of age, which is the start point. Now, the control group were the kids that just had learning problems, and that was 62 of them. There are 19 that only had ADHD, 13 that only were in the autism spectrum, and 9 that combined were ADHD and autism. So it wasn't learning problems and with that, it's just ADHD and autism. And the average range was 8 to 12, and so the last one where it says average, that's just so a visual to get a feel of where they fit in there.
Now, is that norm? Is that sort of considered normal? That's the
right,
sort of
yeah.
expected.
Basically, you think about 10 is mid-average, and so it kind of gave you a visual to compare the other parts of the graph with. So if you look at like story memory, that's where you tell 2 different stories, and when you're done with the story, you just ask them to retell it as best they could. So that's a free recall activity. And as you could tell, the kids that just had learning problems actually did very well with that. The kids with ADHD were still in the average range, but not as strong. The kids with pure autism spectrum, again, were mid-average. But if you had ADHD and autism, you really struggled. And there was just a study that came out in the last week or 2 that looked at the combined ADHD and autism. I think it came out of Kennedy Krieger, in fact. And they realized the cognitive skills deficits are so much more intense if you have combined ADHD and autism. And in their study, about a third of their autism population also had ADHD. So that was showing that that's very tough. Now, one thing I do, because it could be an expressive language problem more than just a memory, like did I get it in? And so if kids are low on that, I immediately do another subtest called story recognition. And with that, you ask questions, and for each question you give 3 choices for the answer, like was the girl's name Mary, Annie, or Betty? And so they'd have to tell you which one is correct. Mm-hmm. And I would have a number of kids that because of that recognition, that scaffolding, they could say, oh yeah, it was Annie. But on their own, they couldn't come up with answers because it was hard to retrieve and organize because of expressive language problems. Now, when you look at the next one, which is design memory, that hits into the idea and temperament of that rhythmicity, that ability to see things in your head in order to organize and plan. And so for this one, they would look at there were like 5 different cards. You'd look at a card for 5 seconds, remembering the design as best you can. It might have been like a couple of circles, a line, and a square. Then you'd take it away, have them wait 10 seconds, and then it draw as much as they could remember. And the kids with learning problems did okay, but the kids with ADHD really struggled. They really couldn't see in their mind, which affects how do I spell, how do I do math.
At any rate, someone did ask to repeat the 5 S's, so I'm going to do that while we're waiting here. The first S was stay calm. The second S was speaking less. That was the idea of trying your message out in almost a Twitter format and using visuals so that it's a very simple message. The third one was slow down. And the fourth was simplify, that is, break things down into component steps. And the fifth was stop and wait. So stay calm, speaking less, slow down, simplify, stop and wait. We're back, and I think we have Dr. McGuire back with us. And what I did while we were trying to juggle around and figure out what had happened to you, I repeated the 5 S's because everybody was very interested in those. So we shared that again, and we can pick right back up with where we were leaving off.
Okay. I think I was doing design memory?
Yes.
Okay. Not knowing how far I got into it, I'll just say that, did you hear the story about my husband?
No, we did not hear the story about your husband. So tell us the story about your husband.
Okay, so when you looked at design memory, you see that the ADHD group had a very hard time being able to revisualize in order to do anything. And with my husband, when the kids were small, we picked them up from daycare, and we were in the kitchen after work talking about, what do you want to do for dinner? And I said, I really don't want to cook. And he said, I don't want to cook either. So I looked at him and I said, what do you think about M, C, D? And he's kind of looking up at his forehead trying to see the letters. And my 7-year-old says, McDonald's, Dad. So he can't visualize, which affects everything he does. And it affects a lot of kids with ADHD, so it's hard to organize, hard to remember how to spell things. All of those things require us to be able to see in our mind. And definitely found that the combined group had the same difficulty on this graph. Now, verbal learning is basically rote memory. I would say a list of words, and they'd have to remember as many as they could in any order, and then we'd practice the same list a total of 4 times. And as you can tell, the kids in the autism spectrum, even then they were in the lower part of the average range. But the people that were combined autism and ADHD, really, rote memory just doesn't work for them. If it's not in context, they just can't learn it and retrieve it, which is something, unfortunately, we work a lot with kids, not just the autism kids, a lot of kids learn from just memorize. And as this shows, that pure rote memorization doesn't work. They've got to understand in context. The next one,
the next one, everybody looks sort of normal, but then you get to finger windows, and it's like all of these, everybody falls off the chart here. So what's
right? But just touching on picture memory, because you have another slide afterwards on picture memory.
Right.
That's it. Did you get that one?
Oh yes, I did, and I'm going to show it.
Okay. But this is to tell you that the ability to look at a picture, remember as many details as you can, and then come back and mark an X on everything that looks changed from the first. So the ability to go into a room and remember where something was, or notice if something was moved. And so although they're kind of in the average range, they're not real strong. And the next slide, which will show after these, next slide shows if I had subtract out items that were marked as different but weren't. So they're kind of like errors of commission, that everybody would have struggled with being able to say, okay, what changed here? And especially the kids that's autism, ADHD. So the ability to notice where something is in your environment, if it moves, being able to identify it again, but also that concept of figure ground. Like if you have your shoes on the floor and your backpack's next to it, but maybe a strap is kind of dangling over part of it, all of a sudden these kids can't tell them apart. Either they'll say they both changed or they won't notice either changed because they can't do that tease apart, and so they make more mistakes.
So these are like false positives, sort of, where they see a change where there wasn't one.
Yeah. And so, of course, they might say, it was right here, it was right here, it was right here, and it might have been there a year ago, but not yesterday. Yeah, that sucks, doesn't it?
That's a harsh world to live in.
Oh, yeah. Now, finger window, that's the one, you're right, that is very, very low, and that's the ability of remembering visual motor sequences. like learning how to tie your shoes, learning how to write, letters and getting, the letters in the right order, learning a combination lock. Do I turn right or left? How many digits? All of that. Anything that requires a visual motor sequence. And all of these kids, because ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, they're all part of the neurodevelopmental disorders. And so, and it's also learning keyboarding. If you cover up their fingers or trying to teach them keyboarding, they can't visualize, they can't remember what order their fingers go. They have to watch them. And then the last one is number letter, like if I said 5SRQ, and again, the only ones that did okay with that were the kids with just autism spectrum. It's a rote memory, but for them at least there's an auditory pattern or sequence, which is why the kids with autism would do okay with that, but everybody else struggles because it's, again, rote memory.
So when a lot of people, as we talk to teachers and special education directors and folks like that who deal with kids a lot who have these kinds of issues, whether they're ADHD or on the spectrum, or whether these are kids who are just learning disabilities, as you're showing here. There's a lot of work that has historically and traditionally gone into accommodations and workarounds and helping them develop those strategies. But also we're starting to see now more of trying to change those underlying processing problems with training, cognitive skill training.
Definitely.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because this is something that it's not coming by naturally. Accommodations don't teach you how to do that. So although they may accommodate in the classroom, when they leave the classroom, they still have no skills in order to handle day-to-day demands that may hit some of the same areas, like work-related. And so the more we can teach those skills, and of course Brainware Safari is an example of that, the better they do. Anything that has more multi-sensory means of interacting and cognitive skills really hits in the visual and auditory, and they do a lot of linking and a lot of sequencing. But the more you can bring in the whole brain at the same time and improve those foundation skills, the better they do in life. And, kids that can't do finger windows, they'll have trouble with a lot of stuff that may be more mechanical in nature. Kids with verbal learning problems, they can't just rote memorize. And, if you have to just memorize stuff for work, it's going to be tough. Things have to be more in context. There's other programs, like for reading, they have, the multi-sensory language, like the Orton-Gillingham, the Wilson, the Slingerland. For math, they have a program that you can buy online. It's called Math UC, which is MATHUSEE. And again, it's very multi-sensory, and it comes from the idea of first bringing the context, bringing it in a concrete manner so it makes sense and it's contextual, and then learning the symbolism behind it. And so when you look at the different skills that Brainware Safari uses, indeed they would build up that foundation skill that just accommodations won't do.
Great. Well, I think what we'll do is when we send out a link to the recorded webinar afterwards, I'll get you to share with me a list of those programs you just mentioned.
Okay,
and
yes.
how people could access more information, because I know that people are often looking for help, and but whether they're parents or whether they're teachers or whatever, because everybody wants to just figure out some way to really help these kids, as opposed to just getting them through their homework for the next day, because that gets
definitely.
It gets pretty tiring. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. I didn't see any more in the chat window, so if it's in the Q&A, I'm not going to be able to see it. But what we'll do is we'll pull those, and if there were questions that I did not, I think there's another one. Oh, someone's saying thank you. So I think we will wrap up. If there were questions that we didn't get to, we will hopefully try to do that. I want to thank everybody for being with us today. And Pat, I especially and specifically want to thank you. You're a font of information and knowledge and reassurance, I think, for parents and teachers who are dealing with kids who have it pretty tough and that are difficult to deal with. I mean, it's not just the kid that's suffering, but it's the parents and the whole environment that really need to figure out these strategies to help. So you've given us some wonderful words of direction and wisdom. So
okay, I'm glad I could help.
Thank you very much, and we hope you'll join us, everybody, for another Neuroscience and Education webinar sometime soon, and have a great afternoon.